Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is the part 3 of the making of the Virtual Riot remix. This is going to be about mixing and mastering. You might be wondering, hey, this video, I didn't hear an announcement about de-streaming it, and in fact, I haven't. I'm not streaming it right now. This is actually because I'm using this video to test something on YouTube. Recently, they've enabled real-time stat tracking for new videos. You can see, you can actually see, like, you know, up to the minute view stats of the videos and also hourly view counts. And what this has illuminated for me is what my prime time is. That is to say, at what time during the day is the largest view totals on my channel. Which I could have sworn there was something like that before, but I couldn't find anything like that in the analytics. So I don't know. What this has basically told me, because whenever I upload a video, it gets sent to the subscriber box, your subscriber window, and people, not everyone watches it all at once, but in fact, in comparison to how many subscribers I have, very few people see it all at once. So I want to try and see if timing the videos towards prime time yields in greater view counts faster. Conventional wisdom says that it should, but I still want to try. So this video, by the time you're watching this video has been done for kind of a long time. I just scheduled the release to be around 10 a.m. EST, which is apparently, or EDT, which is apparently my prime time, according to my view stats. But enough about that. Let's talk about the track. So this track uses my not quite so patented, unbelievable amount of compression in the master. And actually, I had a lot of discussions about mixing and mastering in general with students today. By the way, if you didn't know, I do lessons, and I was talking to pretty much every single one of them today in their scheduled time and wanted to talk about mixing and mastering. So let's talk about how I went about doing this in my completely unlabeled mixer, except for the bits that are labeled. These are automatic labels, which you can do by selecting a number of channels in the insert and in the sequencer, and then coming here and saying Control L or Control Shift L, and then it'll automatically link and name them into mixer inserts. If they're not doing that, the only one that I actually named myself is this guy, where it says side. And this is pretty telling, because the way that I go about any mix in any track, which if you've seen any of the making ofs of any of my previous tracks, you should see this. This is a pretty common deal. Is that I have this sidechain channel. This is where all the elements, all the non-drum elements, are going into it to be sidechained by the kick and the snare. And in fact, we can see this in action. This is what my sidechain looks like. The way the sidechaining works inside FL Studio is that there's a lot of different ways to do it, but the way that I'm doing it here is I'm using the limiter's sidechain input ability. And so I have two limiters because I wanted, you can't have two sidechain sources, although you can group them. What you could do is you can actually group your sidechain sources into a third track and then use that third track as your sidechain source. So then you can essentially sum the audio sources into another track that you wanted to all kind of be combined. But I wanted a different profile for the kick and the snare, although I'm looking at the release time now and I'm kind of seeing that they're pretty similar. So I probably could have gotten away with that. And the reason why I would have is because I'm using sidechain as much of a stylistic effect as sidechaining usually is, but I'm more using it as a mixing tool, where mixing becomes a lot easier when you carve giant holes in your mix that fit perfectly with the shape of your kick and snare, which are the loudest and most disruptive elements in this style of music. So yeah, you have your limiters, and then if you right click it, you get the list of inserts that are linked into the limiter, and you could pick one to be a sidechain source. And right here are the kick and the snare, and here's all the inserts that are all the various things that are being sidechained. Part of the reason why I split up the track like the mix like this, because you see all of those were higher numbers. And that's because I set up my mixer to kind of use the sidechain input as being the halfway point. It divides the mixer, where before the sidechain input is all the drums, and after the sidechain input is all the synths or effects or crashes or whatever. Sometimes because I still sidechain crashes and stuff like that, but I want that to be part of that. The benefit of doing this is that visually it helps you separate the kicks and snares or whatever. But also when in the drums themselves, they are kind of their own little universe. and they exist sort of they kind of be mixed in their own little ways, But I'm looking at this and I'm saying that I routed a lot of the drums just straight to the master. And this is a bit of a deviation for me. I've only done this once before. And the reasons I do it now is the same as the reasons I did it then. And that is that these samples that I'm using are already really, really well crafted. And they're also kind of designed for this style of music and for this style of music. If you don't know, the samples that I'm using were originally made by AU5 to be used in the plugin Break Tweaker by Isotope. And if you've ever listened to any of AU5's music, then this style of very melodic but still very bass and very bright here like sounding songs fit this style of percussion almost to a T, because that's his style. So working in this style meant that the percussion was pretty much good to go. I didn't really need to do a lot about it. Any of the additional routing that I'm doing are usually for hats, and then the hats just get their own reverb channel. And then I guess I'm not doing that here, but they do get their own reverb channel. And then I sidechain. See, the kick is going straight to the sidechain channel. Not much else is doing anything. I guess this is. All right, so I'm making the snare in there into the hats. This is what this is. I'm doing a little archaeology here to find out precisely what I did. Yeah, but usually what would happen is that I'd have a drums bus where I link all the drums together, and then I compress them together in a little mini master, and then it goes out to the master. And then I have essentially two buses, the drums bus and the synth bus. But in this case, I just have a synth bus and the drums just go to the master. So that's really what's up with that. Now, as far as individual things, like actual sounds and whatever, there's kind of two ways. There's two ways to sort of consider the idea of mixing. There's sound design mixing, and then there's actual mixing. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, let's look at the serum basses. Sound design mixing is where we have the element by itself, and we're equalizing it to sound good by itself. And I do weird stuff like, really harsh cuts and big boosts and whatever. Like that, this is actually really benign in comparison to my usual sort of disregard for standard EQing procedures. But that kind of like doing that at the sound design level, where you're not really mixing it. You're not mixing it. You're not mixing at all. You're just changing the sound to sound better. And then you do that. There's only so much you can do to make a sound so good by itself. Because the instant that you introduce that sound against other sounds, it's going to change. And it's going to change in a very specific way. It's going to change, like, our brains are able to, differentiate between there being a bass and there being a hat. But what we can't really hear very well is the interaction between similar frequencies in those two parts. We can tell that they are different parts, but when we hear a bass and then we hear the high frequency bits, like the hi-hats coming together, play together in a track, what we actually hear is that whatever we focus on one of those elements, and then we think ourselves that one element has too much high frequencies, has too many high frequencies. And I mean, logically, we can deduce that it is because we added the hi-hats and that bit, it's too high frequency. And so that's when we apply mixing EQ, where now we go into the hats or we go into the bass and we reduce the amount of high end, either of those halves, so that when they're played together, as they are in this track, they don't overload the high frequencies. That is like the whole purpose of mixing, is that concept. And you can do it with equalizing, or you can do it with leveling. Because if you turn down the new element, or even the old element, then you are reducing overall all the frequencies, including the higher frequencies. So especially if you're turning down something that is only high frequencies, like the hi-hat, then you are reducing over on the entire track the overall high frequency profile. EQing through leveling. And those are the kinds of decisions I made on each individual bit. And it's almost not worth it to go through and try to figure out precisely what they are, because you can more or less hear sort of the behavior. Like the basses all have higher frequencies in them, and they mesh well with the actual high frequency content. Like, so here's actually something interesting. You can see here where This is the sound design EQ right here. Like I kind of moved them around the sound as good as I thought they needed to sound, and I also removed like the low end, that kind of thing. But then over here in the built-in EQ, the three band parametric EQ, I pumped up the high frequencies pretty huge. And this is sort of the result of I put them in there with everything else. I played it, and then I was hearing, the chords could have more high end. I just came in here and then boosted the high end with just the EQ, not even bothering to go back into the other EQ, because I honestly didn't need to. I could have, if I wanted to encapsulate all the changes, sound design and mixing into a single equalizer. It's totally fine to do that. It's not so much it's not like a kind of EQing or a kind of plugin that accomplishes it so much as it is when you are deciding to make those changes. You're either making those changes at the sound design stage or you're making them at the mixing stage, and that's what makes it either sound design or mixing. Yeah. So I do not have a separate sub for any of these. I'm running just whatever the basses are going into anywhere. And for the most part that works because they're pretty consistent sounds. Like these basses here. Like it's not, the low end is not so warbly that it really matters. And there's these guys down here. That they don't really require a lot of reinforcement. It gets a little weird when we get to these kinds of samples, because if you remember in the sound design portion of this making of series, these bits are all they're not from this track, and they are very loose and muddy, and especially later on when we get to the more complicated one, which was this guy. Like, just look at the low end of this when I'm playing it. It's practically percussion. And this translates to a typically muddy low end mix. Fortunately, I'm never really using it for long periods of time. I'm only ever using it as short bits or as filler bits. So I don't have to worry about supporting it with a separate sine sub. Supporting it with a separate sine sub. Oh my God. I'm not worried about that because they are isolated elements. They don't require that. And that makes mixing a lot easier because damn, that would have been hard. At least to try to figure out what the low end would have been. Although I could have just said fuck it and made the low end whatever I wanted, because I doubt the harmonic content of the higher frequencies in that particular sound would, really interfere very much with a different note. Because you have to, like, in this bass, with the phaser business going on, it doesn't have low end. The low end is high passed out, but we can still tell what note it is. So that means that when this guy's higher frequency harmonic content interacts with this guy's higher frequency harmonic content, it's the same note, because it is the same note. But you can also look at it and see very well-defined, spread out, even and unmoving harmonics versus the EQ from Mr. 106 here. Which is such an incredible mess. So that means that any sort of support underneath that would have been totally just misguided. But using that and still feeling bass beneath that is very much a product of how I handle the mastering in this whole thing. So I talk about this a lot when I reference mastering and anything else. And this also, again, is a big conversation that I have with students. The traditional way that people do mastering and mixing is that they have this idea of a pre-master. And this means that your pre-master is where you are making the song without compression on the master. And you're doing it you're essentially making the song sound as good as possible without compression to your ears, just saying, feeling good and all that, whatever. And then the mastering engineer's job, if that's still you, is to essentially take that and then make it as loud as possible while still preserving the original vision of the song. And that's all well and good. The problem with that, though, is that, especially for genres like these, how the mastering compression and how we compress everything together is very much a stylistic, it's a style. It's part of the style. Like it's an indicator of whatever genre we're doing, especially the heavier styles of bass music, which I do. This is what this is. and it could have all the dynamic range in the world, and it could have all the none like compression in the world. It actually wouldn't even matter how loud it was, because it's not really about the punchiness or the loudness, although those are important. Those are important traits. But if it doesn't sound glued together and compressed in a forceful way, at least to my ears, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like the actual genre it's supposed to be in. This isn't true for, down tempo stuff and like liquid genres and a little bit, but like it's in other genres of music that are softer than this kind of thing. This is not something that's totally true. And those are also the kinds of thing where this paradigm of the pre-master was created for those ideas. And I'm starting to kind of think that if you're going to be doing this kind of harder style of music, then the way that I'm doing it is probably the way you should be doing it, which is that you build your track and you have everything going on, including your mixing, with the master compression already on. And that's what I do when I make, I made this track. Actually, it's a bit different because I made the liquid bit before I made everything else. And I put the mastering on this part alone. And then once I made enough, once I made the main bass, the drums, and probably put the ambient stems over it, that was when I said, okay, cool, I'm gonna make the mastering now. And then I made my mastering. So let's talk about the mastering a second, and I'll talk about how why this is important. So in the low end, I didn't really worry so much about my usual fastidiousness about how the kick transient is louder than the bass transients or whatever. I probably could have, but I didn't really feel necessary. So I just made the low end loud enough, and that's fine. It's monoed, which is what this knob here does, makes it mono. The mids and the highs are they're just louded up a bit. So something to talk about is that it doesn't actually really matter how loud I made it, just as long as I made the 3 bits consistent, that they all peaked at a consistent level, peaked consistently at 0 dB. And it could have been 0 dB, it could have been plus 2 dB, it could have been minus 6 dB. It didn't actually matter, just as long as it was consistent. And something else about the whole pre-master idea is that people generally want to have everything below 6 dB and that kind of thing. And that whole idea is born of the fact that you're probably going to send your pre-master to a different person, a mastering engineer. And if you're doing that, you want to make damn sure that you have all of your dynamic range. You don't have distorted peaks. And so you want minus 6 dB just to get as far away from 0 dB as possible. Not really as possible, but because you don't want to just go to the noise floor and have to deal with that. Ideally, your peak would be at 0 dB, and then they'd be fine. And there's some phase distortion problems that happen when certain changes and like the phases end up pushing audio higher than 0 dB, even if at that particular sampling position is not actually at higher than 0 dB, and so there are some problems associated with that. But the minus 6 part is really a lot farther down than it really is necessary. But it's again just a safety concept, and we don't have to care about any of that, especially if we're doing it all in DAW, because the DAW, FL, and other DAWs as well, they're transmitting information internally at 32-bit, and I'm not talking about x86 here. I'm talking about bit depth, 24-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit. And 32-bit depth, essentially, it means funky things, but the part that matters is that if you peak above 0 dB, it doesn't matter. Those peaks are still there. They're above 0 dB, and if you did actually hear them come out at 0 dB at the master, you would hear them distort. But that's just because your playback isn't 32-bit. It's probably 24-bit. There are some 32-bit interfaces, but it's not super important. So as long internally, so that means I could redline mixer inserts all day, but as long as in the master I brought it down below 0 dB at the very end, it's all going to still be there. I'm not going to actually lose the peaking data. It's going to go above 0 dB, but I can bring it back down. It'll be precisely what it was when you pushed it through, everything else. The redlining is purely visual aspect, just reminding you that it's going above 0 dB. So that's why I was saying that it doesn't necessarily matter how loud I made it in the pre-master sense, the 3 bands before the master in the compressor, because I just wanted them to be consistent, and 0 dB is, fine, whatever. Now, on the master itself, I'm using 2 ideas to kind of govern what's happening here. I'm using a little bit of real compression, which is what this is here, and I'm using a whole lot of soft saturation. Here's an example, by the way, of pushing things hard. The peaks going into the master part of the compressor here are plus 9 dB. It's kind of a lot. So soft saturation, what this is essentially distortion. How hard you push it through the distortion, it depends, will determine how obviously distorted it sounds. And actually, this track sounds pretty distorted, but that's twofold. It's A, because I'm doing this, and B, because the sounds I'm using are distorted anyway. And it's part of the reason why I'm able to even do this, is because all the distortion is doing in this case is adding additional harmonics. And if your content already has a plethora of high harmonic content, then it's not going to be super noticeable. But if it gets pushed way too hard, then the harmonics become more and lower, and it becomes incredibly obvious as being distorted. So that's A, why I keep it at 0 dB, and B, why I'm having also compression involved here. The compression is interacting softly with everything, but it's bringing it down just a little bit below what it would be normally anyway, so that it's interacting with the soft saturation less than it would have if I just went straight through. Sometimes I go straight through. There are some tracks that I do that I don't even compress the master. I just distort it, and it works because, again, everything is already distorted, and I can do that. Now, this is actually also why I have two Maximuses, and one's on and one's off, because one of them is this guy and has the soft saturation, and the other one does not. It's essentially the same thing as everything else. So some minor changes to the low mid high bands, but generally speaking, it's the same thing, except that there's no soft saturation. I'm doing everything just with total compression, and this is for the parts of the song that are not very heavy, not full of high frequency content, and not high energy, because if you send a rounded sound through there, a sound that doesn't have a lot of high frequency content, it adds even a little bit of high frequency content. You can hear it, and it becomes super duper obviously distorted, even if it's just a little bit, tiniest bit. And I actually got into a little bit of trouble during the break down over here. In fact, you can still hear it. It's still doing it, which means I didn't really do a good job. I could have sworn I fixed that. In fact, I'm pretty sure that if I were to go listen to the SoundCloud version right now, it would actually be fixed. And did I not save it? Yeah, well, despite this being a mistake, it's actually pretty good that I left this here as an example of why I do this kind of thing. But the reason why the reason why this is happening is because I kept it on the high energy Maximus. And the reason why I did that is because it went straight into this part. And the reason why that matters is because there's actually a tremendous volume difference between the two Maximuses I have engaged. And I use that Maximus during the rises. See right here, if I didn't have regular normal compression engaged right now, with time variables that are not faster than the wavelength, this would have been a distorted mess as it was during the previous section. But because I'm not using soft saturation, it's on, but I'm not using it because the compression is keeping it below 0 dB. It's softer. It cares more, you know. So there is no distortion. There's a little tiniest bit of like regular compression artifacting, but again, it's part of the style that it has that. Actually, I'm more or less used to it by now in terms of that sound. I am still kind of annoyed at this business though. Yeah. Now, weird things happen when you have the mastering on while you're mixing. It doesn't actually matter though, because and this is I discovered that this is a shock to some of the students that when we talk about mixing and mastering, but when people, even when they have a dedicated mastering engineer, they do revisions. They do a lot of revisions, because what's going to happen is that you're going to make your track. It's going to sound nice and good without compression. And then you're going to get it mastered. You're going to get it back and it's going to sound fucking bad to you. And chances are it's because your track wasn't mixed to be compressed. It was mixed to sound good on its own without compression, which does not translate to sounding good while compressed, especially for this style. Because you can make it sound good with compression, it just won't be, with the regular like good sounding mix. Just because, but it won't be very loud. It won't be as loud as it could be. It won't be very punchy. It'll be as loud as you can possibly make that while still sounding good. But it won't sound like, I guarantee you, it won't sound the way you were envisioning it regarding sound. And this is because you have to take into consideration a particular kind of behavior of your track when it's going to be compressed. The biggest one is that in a track where drums are very punchy, very loud, and very present, that's generally because the drums are incredibly louder than everything else. In fact, let's turn off the master effects and turn it down to the point where it's peaking below 0 dB. If I were to have changed that level, you would definitely hear the dynamic range squashing. Some people have demonstrated that, and like I'm not necessarily saying dynamic range is bad, but this is not what the style calls for. The what I wanted to show you there is that the drums, the kick and the snare especially, are a lot louder than everything else. Louder to the point where if it were played at volume, at a level where it sounded good loudness wise, it would be a lot louder than everything else, and everything else would sound quiet in comparison, and that's on purpose. And also you might be thinking, well, it actually still kind of sounded kind of compressed. And why is that? That has to do with the electronic nature of of really any style of music that is electronic. And that's that the source of sounds that we're using are perfect. And they generally don't have a huge amount of dynamic range in them. Like, dynamic range is mostly a product of, well, honestly, it's a difference in volume. And if you just play a constant saw wave and the volumes never change, your dynamic range is never going to change for that instrument. So that means that everything is consistent, everything is level, everything is still pretty together. Also because sidechaining, that's a pretty big reason why it still sounded compressed. And it also has less to do with compressing individual objects, individual synths and stuff. Some people often asked, is it good to compress synths? Is it good to compress individual instruments and put compression on stuff before it goes into master? You have to think about what compression is for and what it does. You can do interesting things sound design wise. You can make a lot of really interesting movement and sort of effects, kind of whatever. But in the mixing sense, consider what compression is for. Compression, the term compression means we're taking a range of something and making it smaller range. That's compression. We're compressing whatever that range is. In this case, it's dynamic range. And this means the distance between the lowest peak and the highest peak. I do note that I say the lowest peak and the highest peak, not the lowest level, because the lowest level is probably 0 dB. That would be had minus infinity to 0 dB, minus infinity to 0 dB dynamic range. When you really just have a moment of silence in your track, and that's not the same thing. That's negative space. That's not dynamic range. Dynamic range is lowest peak to highest peak. So a compressor's point is that it's compressing the dynamic range, bringing the lows up and the highs down, presumably. So if you have like a saw wave bass that never changes volume, that is always one volume, you can't compress it. There's nothing to compress. You can distort it and wave shape it and increase the amplitude of the individual waveform oscillations, but that's sound design. That's not mixing. And you can use multiband compression to level out, the high frequencies versus the low frequencies, but that's just fancy equalizing. Because compression at the end of the day is just really tight volume automation that we use to trick our brains into thinking stuff's louder or quieter. So like I was saying, individual things in your mix are going to be pretty consistently sounding. Even vocals, you can even look at it. There's not a huge amount of dynamic range. The bits of it that are dynamic are essentially moments of silence and breathing and crap like that. That's not dynamic range. That's negative space. And even look at the stems, the chord stems, just solid, not a lot going on. And so even without master compression, it still sounded pretty compressed because honestly, it was. There was never a lot of dynamic range to begin with. And also sidechaining still sounds compressed because funnily enough, the concept of sidechaining is born of an effect that came from a mixing error back in the day, which I find hilarious. But hey, styles change, and, things are nice. So I kind of use this as a massive kind of podium, like a soapbox, to just talk about mixing and mastering in general. How this track was actually mixed is pretty just straightforward for me. I bust all this into the one thing, the drums also went in the master, sidechaining happened, and I pumped everything up as loud as it could go before it sounded too bad. And some people actually say that I did get too bad, that there was too much distortion in this track and that it sounded bad to them. And you are totally, fine to that opinion. That's something you can have. That's all right. It was on purpose, except for this part. It wasn't on purpose. God damn it. I even, actually, well, not that part, this part. I even, turned it down right here.
Keep your head high, looking at the night sky, and now we're not alone. Keep your head high, and now we're die, and now die, and die, and night sky, and now we're not alone.
Actually, this is something wonderful that I should bring attention to. You might be wondering what the hell this is I'm turning down, because it certainly doesn't sound like the vocals are turning down. In fact, it doesn't sound like anything's turning down. And actually, what it is turning down is the bass. This guy. And that's because in terms of output, lower frequencies have a lot more power than higher frequencies to sound as loud. But that the particular relationship isn't what's important here. Is that there being as much low end as there was forcing the vocals to go up with it, to go above 0 dB to get distorted. So I was turning the bass down so that didn't get pushed up into the compression so hard. But it didn't sound like it was getting quieter. I mean, it does, but very subtly. And the reason why it doesn't is because it's still at 0 dB, just not as hard at 0 dB. And this is actually a wonderful demonstration of a particular behavior before compression in how you do leveling. If you have two things going into compression, they're being compressed together, they're both redlining, they're both very loud, and you turn one thing down, this thing is not going to sound like it gets quieter. This thing is going to sound like it gets louder. And this thing will sound like whatever the original level it was. That kind of backwards relationship of leveling is true for any kind of behavior into compression, especially equalizing. And so, to a certain extent, you can brute force it. You can turn something up so hard that it just kills everything else. You can EQ up a particular part of the spectrum so hard that it just kills everything else. You can do that. But at the subtle lower levels, the behavior I described is what exists. And this is a consideration you have to make when you're doing your mixing, when you have your mastering compression on. And you're probably going to end up doing stuff like you're going to do the result. You're going to do the result of this stuff anyway, even if you do have a pre-master master relationship and you send your track off to get mastered. It's going to come back. You're going to go back and make changes to your mix. Like you're probably going to think, the drums get kind of drowned out when it gets mastered. I think I'm going to go pump up the drums. And then the drums are going to come back and they'll actually hit harder, the more that it gets pushed in. You might be thinking, well, that's the exact opposite of what you just said. And it has to do with the fact that the sidechaining happens. And then also we are turning up the drums kind of a lot to achieve that sort of relationship. And that's what I was talking about, by brute forcing it. Those things, that kind of idea works, especially for what, the kick and the snare, which are the loudest, most disruptive things in your track. Which is also why when I do multi-band compression, I set up the band splits to represent them. The low end is where the kick lives, and the mid split is determined by where the snare's fundamental tone lives. A little bit lower than where the snare's transient lives, because that's fundamental tone is, rather, because these splits are not super sharp, so that means that a little bit gets into the lower end than you would like. Probably. Yeah. So I hope I adequately explained what's happening here. And I also hope that I kind of unloaded a lot of reasonable information onto you as in regards to mixing and mastering. One of these days, I'll do a dedicated tutorial about that once I've actually managed to sort of solve for N for mastering and mixing. The reason why I haven't is because a lot of what I do, while still similar across various tracks, is still very case by case. And I have yet to really solve for all cases to the point where I can teach confidently about it. So one day I will, and it'll be nice. though. In the meantime, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.